Sure, it's a good idea.
Okay, cool. Well, today's lecture and presentation is called The Biophysics Behind Gender Personae, Queer Theory, and the Dismantling of the Category Binary. Sounds like a lot of fancy terms, but what these people do is they use fancy terms because they think they have substance. And in reality, they have no substance. These people are experts at using language, and we will discover today that these people, in terms of gender ideology, we're going to be talking about the postmodernist side of the woke. So we discussed before that an authentic woke person has two sides, and that these two sides are co-contingent on each other. They're co-eternal, and they make the authentically woke. You have the neo-Marxist side, and then you have the postmodernist side. So a woke person can be called perfectly as a neo-Marxist postmodernist, or you could say postmodernist neo-Marxist. It wouldn't matter. That is one of the best ways to sum up what woke is in terms of the person's view on reality. It's neo-Marxist and it's postmodernist. This side, in terms of the gender ideology, is the postmodernist side, and we'll be discussing actually why it's postmodernist. It's also neo-Marxist, but in terms of understanding the gender ideology, the philosophy behind it is exclusively postmodernist. The politics behind it is neo-Marxist, but the philosophy behind it is almost exclusively, entirely postmodernist. And there's a fantastic, beautiful reason as to why that is, and we will get to that in a second. The first part, though, of this lecture is actually the biophysics of it all. And that's important to understand because gender is actually, in terms of reality, something real. It's not some type of ethereal substance out there in the cosmos. It's something that has a biologically primed existence. So we're first going to talk about the biophysics of sex differences and why differences in sex differences leads to gender differences. Gender, again, is not some metaphysical moldable substance in the ether, as the radical Marcusean left would want you to believe. There is a fixed biological reality to sex differences, and the visceral experience of that fixed biological reality is called gender. So you have a fixed biological reality, whatever that may be, and some people vary. Very little do people vary. Either people are born female or male. They're born, female or male. That's different in a lot of ways than man and woman, and we'll discuss that in a second. We'll also be discussing what a woman is. I'm sure everybody's heard of that fantastic documentary. That's another story. There's a fixed biological reality to sex differences, and the visceral experience of that fixed biological reality is called gender. So the behavioral manifestations of the fixed biological reality is gender. So if you have a fixed biological reality, which everybody has, that will lead to behavioral manifestations, and that is gender. Sure, women and men are socially constructed categories, but they are historically justified by reference to biological differences, and biological differences alone. There is no exception to that rule of thumb at all. We're going to be talking about some of these categories, these norms, as they would call it. Sometimes people call them gender roles. Gender roles are historically evidenced. Gender roles are not something that the hegemonic, heteronormative, androcentric male induced into society to control women. That's not the case. That is the fundamental claim of the end to second and third wave feminists, sure. So most of all feminist studies, fraudulent or authentic, arose from the empirical fact that women in society are disadvantaged. Authentic feminists wish to give them opportunity. Fraudulent feminists wish to give them outcome. Authentic feminists grasp human nature. Fraudulent feminists deny it. We will talk about why women are disadvantaged here in a bit. But I must first ask a question, and there is an answer to this question. It's an important question. Why are feminists today entirely and almost exclusively postmodern? So this is the other side of the woke persona. You're a neo-Marxist and you're also a postmodernist. If you're an advocate for gender ideology, the only means by which you can substantiate that type of belief system is through postmodernism. So the question is, why are almost all feminists today entirely and almost exclusively postmodern? Why have they all been so reliant on Foucauldian and Derridian discourse? If you look at today's modern feminists, the most prominent being Judith Butler and Gail Rubin, perhaps, you shall see that they openly reject objective reality. And they openly reject it as some kind of androcentric heteronormative construct. And they seriously dare accuse the right of conspiracy theories? The idea that that objective reality is some kind of historical androcentric heteronormative hegemon put in place to oppress women is the grand conspiracy theory. And it's funny because they accuse the right of conspiracy theories. That's a grand conspiracy theory. That is a totalizing grand conspiracy theory. But back to my question, why in a course on gender theory or women's studies are we all made to read Foucault and Derrida? You go to any college in North America, and if you're in college and you're taking a class on women's studies, whatever the hell that is, gender theory, whatever the hell that is, you'll realize that what you're actually doing is you're just reading Foucault and Derrida. You're reading people like Judith Butler and Gail Rubin. And you have to understand why this is, though. And this is where I said that the answer is awesome. Because the empirical and objective data for sex differences is so overwhelming that it is patently undeniable. Men and women do differ, and those differences are not social fictions created by men to oppress women. That's the grand conspiracy theory I was talking about. The differences between women and men are so overwhelming and tangible. You have to have something as cryptic and sophisticated as postmodernist jargon to deny it. We discussed earlier that postmodernism is a mass-scale response mechanism to an objective reality. To objective reality. This objective reality was the utter failures of socialism. It was the utter failures of an ultimate political vision. Why is the philosophical discourse behind gender ideology exclusively postmodern? That's the question here. Because it is objective reality that they are facing, and it is objective reality that they are fighting. We talked about positional standpoint epistemology as well. I think I did an entire lecture on that, and we came to the understanding that positional standpoint epistemology is fundamentally the idea that your lived experience as a minority of whatever victim paradigm has a higher epistemological truth value than does objective reality. And a higher epistemological truth value than traditional ways of knowing. Now, traditional ways of knowing, the umbrella of traditional ways of knowing are things like logic, correspondence, validity, evidence, reason, so on and so on. Your lived experience has a higher truth value than traditional ways of knowing? Yes, that is the fundamental idea behind positional standpoint epistemology. It is a tool to subvert objective reality. I mention this because objective reality, this objective reality denying tool is a product of feminism. Positional standpoint epistemology actually grew out of feminist discourse. Sandra Harding, who also wrote in her famous book, literally said that Newton's Principia is a rape manual. And she coined the term positional standpoint theory. Epistemology, same thing. So I ask again, why is the philosophical discourse behind gender ideology exclusively postmodern? Because it is objective reality that they are facing, and it is objective reality that they are fighting. The reason why this answer is so satisfying is because it proves the entire point, that sexual differences and gender differences between females and males are a matter of objective reality. Why would you be so reliant on postmodern discourse if it wasn't the case? I mean, the answer to that question is so satisfying because it is objective reality that they're denying. It is the objective reality that there are differences between men and women. And the differences are so real and tangible that you have to have something as sophisticated as Foucauldian and Derridian BS to redeem yourself. So we're not going to discuss in painstaking detail biophysics of gender and sex. We're going to I'm going to give you sort of a low-resolution perspective because I don't have enough time, honestly, to do that, but that's okay. There is a reciprocating, co-contingent, dependent neurobiological connection between mother and her infant. In other words, that there is a tangible feedback system, a tangible feedback loop between mother and child, and such is not something people can just sidestep. The mother is literally an extension of her infant. Not like figuratively, not like, oh, maybe. No, literally an extension of the infant. The term for this kind of visceral and tangible connection between the infant and its mother is that they are biochemical analogs to each other. So when I commit the mortal sin and say that a hypersexist statement that fathers cannot be mothers, which is hypersexist, right? Fathers can't be mothers. This is precisely what I mean. Fathers are not extensions of their offspring. They are not biochemical analogs. So an example of this kind of level of connection, these kind of extremes I'm talking about here, would be if you were to remove the baby from the mother's arms. Time will show, and this is fundamentally proven in primate studies, that there is a cascading effect of hormones and neuropeptides in both brains that is literally synonymous with the neurochemistry of substance withdrawal. And this has been tested and confirmed hundreds of times. When you remove the baby from the mother's arms, the neurochemical response across linear time is literally the same kind of neurochemical response that you would receive from drug withdrawals. The substance withdrawal happens when you are on a pharmaceutical substance, perhaps, for such a long time that it becomes part of the neural architecture of the brain. When you quit cold turkey, you suffer from the effects of what is called withdrawal. Removing the infant from the mother's arms and enforcing some kind of spatial separation will induce in both their brains essentially the same effects of drug withdrawal. Drug withdrawal is so bad because it was at that point that the drug was an extension of your brain's function. This is true. If you're a cocaine addict, for example, you can't just quit cold turkey. The cocaine is literally an extension of how your brain functions at that point. You have to wean off of in some way. But this is just an example of so many other ways that the baby, the infant, is a biochemical analog to the mother that the father would never be, ever. Another example showing that the connection between mother and infant is so real as that between a handset and a phone line is shown in the fact that they have hypersensitive modalities to their infants. For example, you can put a set of 30 infants into a room, and if for some reason they are all crying, the mother can be blindfolded and have no troubles finding her baby's voice. And again, this is just another example. I can name dozens upon dozens of other examples showing that mothers, unlike fathers, are literally physical extensions of their infant. But it is more important at this point to understand the implications of this. What does it mean? Well, it means that the spirit of motherhood is universal. And this is so very, very meaningful at every instant. And things like state-sanctioned character development, things like SEL, cultural responsive teaching, robs you all of that biological reality. It robs you of your motherhood. It robs you of your nature and your spirit. Now, in a developed society, in a society full of authentic liberal feminists, the point is not whether or not nature has ordained you with particular immutable characteristics, but whether or not you can choose to do and be otherwise. That's very important in a liberal society. Yes, women have disadvantages that are fundamental. One of the reasons why there is a very large gender pay gap is because, unlike men, women have to literally raise humanity with the total sum of her body and mind. In a lot of instances, women are not able to get jobs because, again, they're raising humanity with the total sum of their body and mind. This is not a trivial point. The idea that the gender pay gap is all socially constructed and a cynical force perpetuated by heteronormative androcentric men to keep women in their place is a fundamental lie, and you can prove that through simple data analysis. The source of nearly all gender differences, that is the behavior manifestations of fixed biological realities, is the mother and the infant. So you'll realize that, yes, women act differently than men. Women have different traits than men, right? And men have different traits than women. This all leads back to the mother and the child. And the mother and the child is a relationship that has existed for all of time. And it has existed in all of cultures ever documented, and all the ethnographic studies have shown that these differences are universal. Now, I'm not going to get too much of the data, but there are the data is so overwhelming that it is not possible to deny unless you are ideologically ridden. It is not possible to deny. The data is so crystal clear. And some of the giants who pump out this data into the scientific community are people like Melissa Hines and Eleanor Maccabee, Stephen LeVay, Costin McCry, Cosmides, and so many others. They're all saying the same stuff. And sure, maybe you'll have a liberal in there, you'll have an anarchist in there, sometimes you'll have a Republican in there, but they're all saying the same stuff because the data does not lie. Now, another very interesting thing about motherhood, and it's very important to understand that what we would be defining in this sense is gender. And gender is the behavioral manifestations of a fixed biological reality. Right? That's the definition of gender in the scholastic literature. It is the behavioral manifestations, and that's the differences between sex. The sex is the reality of the matter. Gender is the behavioral manifestations because of that reality. Right? So people may have different genders, right? And people may express themselves differently. The way in which a person expresses themselves all leads back to their biological sexual reality. For example, if you're an authentic trans, and I say authentic because there are transsexual people who are not authentic. They are transsexual solely because they are ideologically possessed. And that's actually true. But there are authentic transsexuals, and those are the people that we should be protecting. And these people are born, essentially, with female brains, and they're in male bodies. This is an objective reality. Now, it's very rare for this to be the case. Marcusean left would suggest that the idea that it's rare is something that the heteronormative community has injected into the lives of people. So it's a kind of false consciousness. It's like, no, it's very rare. It doesn't happen hardly ever. And the new spike of transgenders has a lot to do with being ideologically possessed than it does with biological reality. Transgenderism, though, is a real thing. And the behavioral manifestations of it, the psychosocial manifestations of an authentically transgender person is what the literature calls sexual dysmorphia. And it is what people suffer from because they're in the wrong body. Now, of course, there are things like therapy that can address these things. There are things like medication that can address these things. The gender ideology of the Marcusean left radicalizes this into an entirely different field of operation. They believe that because you're transgender, you have a special insight to how the world works, and that this special insight has higher, again, epistemological truth values than does normal things like logic, reason, deduction, correspondence, validity, things like that. But I must take your attention to one of the most destructive arguments in terms of putting the gender ideology to rest. And it is something that you can map out on reality. It's something that you can tangibly see with your eyes. It is something that is so real that you can feel it if you were able to put them in both of your hands. The brain of the female and the male are different, and they're different on physical levels that you cannot deny. You cannot deny because your senses would suggest that denying it would be hallucinatory. One of these things is, so being a woman, for example, you have 20 times more oxytocin than a male does, and a male has 20 times more testosterone than a woman does. This is the case across all of cultures that have ever been ethnographically studied and documented. There is no exception to this. Women have more oxytocin on very high levels than men do. Men have high levels of testosterone. Now, what is the point of this, though? Well, testosterone and oxytocin are both neuropeptides that have dichotomous natures. That is, their natures completely conflict with each other. And when you have a nervous system and nervous tissue wherein oxytocin is coursing throughout, what you have are behavioral manifestations in light of that neuropeptide. If you have a nervous system or nervous tissue that of which is coursing with testosterone, there are behavioral manifestations, right? And those behavioral manifestations are called gender. Those behavioral manifestations are called gender roles, for example. Those behavioral manifestations are called gender performativity, you could say. Okay? Now, what is it about these neuropeptides that are so interesting? Well, oxytocin and testosterone are two neuropeptides that do the complete opposite thing. They're completely dichotomous. Testosterone, for example, is all about inducing status in the organism, aggression, goal-oriented tasks. This is what testosterone does, and to some extent serotonin. Oxytocin does the complete opposite. Oxytocin is a neuropeptide that induces things such as anti-aggression strategies, caring, emotional expressiveness. All the things that you can contribute to the archetype of a female is actually in light of oxytocin. And then the neurological and post and prenatal endocrinological literature on this is so crystal clear. You cannot deny it unless you're ideologically ridden. Testosterone and oxytocin. A man has essentially 20 times more testosterone than a woman. A woman has 20 times more oxytocin than a man. These produce, along that trajectory, behavioral manifestations. And these behavioral manifestations are what you can call gender, and what you can call gender performativity, what you can call gender roles, right? And so that is something that must be understood, for and foremost. The other thing that determines gender, and that's a big one right there. The other thing that determines gender is gender in the sense that what gender is the behavioral manifestations of a fixed biological reality. An example of a fixed biological reality would be the fact that maybe men have 20 times more testosterone than a woman does, right? The behavioral manifestations of that is called gender. right? And that's just an example. As I've said, I'm not going to get deep into the biophysics of all this because it actually does get very complicated. But this is a very low-resolution perspective that is hyper-accurate. And there isn't any serious scientist in the world right now that questions this. The other fundamental predicate of gender, and there are several, is parental investment. Now, parental investment is very interesting because across all cultures you'll ever find, across all societies that have been ever ethnographically studied, the bulk of parental investment is at the mother's feet. And there's no exception to this law. This is undeniable. This is incontestable. This is irrevocable. The bulk of parental investment is at the mother's feet. Now, that means a lot in terms of things like inducing quotas, or in terms of things such as, why is there a gender pay gap? Again, I said at the beginning that one of the primary reasons why there is a gender pay gap is because the bulk of parental investment is at the mother's feet. Because mothers, by their very spirit, and by their ordained immutable characteristics, and by their nature, raise humanity with the sum total of their body and mind. This is a fundamental truth. As soon as there is the status of conception, the mother is biologically primed to have the baby. She fundamentally changes on a personality level as soon as the sperm meets the oocyte. There is a fundamental change, and the fundamental change doesn't end. It progresses and it exponentializes during the time she is with the child. And this fundamentally changes her character. This induces a cascading effect of hormones. And all these things are priming her, essentially, to raise humanity with the sum total of her body and mind. Why are there not women in politics? Why is there no such thing as an authentic matriarchy? One of the reasons why this is because you can't have that and raise humanity. Part of raising humanity means not being aggressive. It means that if you're aggressive, you're going to kill your child. It means if you're aggressive, you're not a mother. And also, you can go back to the biological reality and suggest also that she's not aggressive because she has 20 times less testosterone than a male does. Now, if I get into things like transgendered people, if you're an authentically transgendered person and you were born female, you have testosterone that is 20 times higher than a male, or than a female. If you're born female and you have a male brain, your testosterone levels are much higher than a normal female. That's why we can't have transgendered people in sports who are trying out in the women's. You just can't have that. Or it goes the other way around as well, actually. And it's that's another story. But it's important to understand that those two factors, the parental investment, the bulk of parental investment, this is also the case in all of primate species that have ever been documented. Nearly all primate. There's rare exceptions. That the bulk of parental investment is at the mother's feet. This is so important. Now, in terms of gender roles, what does this mean in terms of gender roles? Well, I proposed a problem that I wanted answered in an article, and I said that if anybody can answer this or come to a contrary conclusion, I would provide them with a very large sum of money. And so there are two premises, and the first premise is the bulk of parental investment is at the mother's feet. You cannot deny that. You cannot deny that because the baby, the infant, is an extension of the mother. Is a biological, biochemical analog to the mother's substance in a way that the father could never be. And this is the fundamental case. So the bulk of parental investment is at the mother's feet, right? Because the baby is the mother in many ways, and the mother is the baby. That's the premise number one. Premise number two is the only place to raise a child is a unpredictable, or not an unpredictable social space. And what you can call that is a home. A home is a place that has been established as a social space for the mother and the infant, or for the family, right? What a home is not an environment that's unpredictable, okay? So the only place to raise a child is in an environment that isn't immediately unpredictable. So it's the home, right? This also goes into the SEL stuff and all that other stuff, but that's another story. Now, these two premises, the idea that the bulk of parental investment is at the feet of the mother, and that the only place to raise a child is in a social space that isn't unpredictable. You put those two premises together, and you get in a lot of ways, the mothering persona. You get, why is the archetype of housewife truly sexist? Is it something that was is it a social fiction that was invented by men to oppress women? It's like, no, it's not. And the challenge was to answer that. And of course, I've not received any successful responses. And I put $5,000 on the table, actually, to anybody who could solve that riddle. Is it not the case that that is the case? And those two premises are incontestable. There's no way to really go around them. And you can see them with your eyes. You can feel them with your body. These are so real. They're so objective, right? Now, you have two people, the gender ideology, the fairy godmothers of the gender ideology are two people, and their names are Gail Rubin and Judith Butler, and both postmodernists. We've discussed why they're postmodernists, and we've discussed why everything about gender ideology is fundamentally predicated on Foucauldian, Derridian BS. And that is because what they're facing is objective reality. And I've just mentioned a little tiny bit of the objective reality. I didn't even get into the data. I can get into the data, but as I've said, I'm not going to do that because that's going to take a while. I don't have to get into the data. The fundamental purpose of gender ideology is to subvert the objective. And there's no other better tool in the universe other than do that, other than postmodernist cryptic prose jargon. Now, Judith Butler recently won the worst writing award, actually. I think it might have been in 2016 or 17. But there is an organization, reputable organization, I forget what they're called, and they just go around and they look at literature and they find the worst writing. And she won first prize. She won first prize. It was pretty funny. The second prize winner was a person named Gayatri Spivak, who is a post-colonialist, right? So another neo-Marxist postmodernist. But it's just funny how she won the worst writing award because what she writes is literally just cryptic prose, postmodern jargon. And there isn't any other better tool to subvert objective reality than postmodernism. And so the gender ideology, the whole animus force behind gender ideology is postmodernism, because it's objective reality that they're facing, and it's objective reality that they're fighting. It is because of that case that you've already won the argument. It suggests that the differences between male and female are a matter of objective reality. You're done with the argument. You don't need to go any further. You're finished. And they don't realize that in their writing, that because your writing is fundamentally predicated on Derridian and Foucauldian postmodern jargon, it means that you've lost the game. You've lost because you are responding to objective reality. And yes, sex differences between men and women so happen to be a matter of objective truth, of objective facts, of objective reality. And so this leads me to a third marker, and that is patriarchy. And the antonym for patriarchy, obviously, is matriarchy. Now, there has never been, in terms of anthropological literature, and those are the only people who study things like this, that has suggested that a matriarchy has ever existed. There are things such as matrifocal societies or matrilineal societies. There has been never, according to the literature, an authentic full-fledged matriarchal society ever in existence. And there's a very simple reason as to why that is. And I mentioned politics. Why are men always in politics? Well, because in order to be in politics, you have to be aggressive. You have to have that 20 times more testosterone than the woman does. And it isn't the case that women have that. And that's not a bad thing, okay? The idea that it's a bad thing is a misplacement of where your anger should be. Because women do so much more than men, to be honest with you. There isn't anything about men that consists of so a good way to distinguish between men and women in this regard is that women raise humanity and men raise societies. And that is a fundamental truth. And it all leads back to the fact that men have 20 times more testosterone and women have 20 times more oxytocin. It's technically 5 to 10 to 20. And so matriarchy, for example. A matriarchy is defined in which a governing body is ruled by women. In other words, the politics, the arena of politics is ruled by women. Never in history, ever in existence, has there ever been a documentation, has there ever been an ethnographic study that has suggested that a matriarchy has existed. The only suggestion that there has been is through the works of Margaret Mead. And Margaret Mead wrote some things about matriarchy and suggested that the tribes that she has come across inverse the gender roles. Now, of course, there was a person named Stephen Goldberg who responded to Margaret Mead, and Margaret Mead conceded in an open letter, hey, I'm wrong about everything I said. And actually, she said that after the first statement which she suggested, she said that actually I wasn't looking for the inverse of sexual roles. And so if you're at a college campus and you're talking about gender roles, Margaret Mead's going to be mentioned all the darn time. And it's just so funny because Margaret Mead herself said that she was wrong. And she conceded in Stephen Goldberg. And Stephen Goldberg wrote a book called The Inevitability of Patriarchy. And he had a correspondence with Margaret Mead in that text where that admission of falsehood was given. And so the only evidence that you could even possibly hint at would be Margaret Mead, and that evidence is completely, has been completely dismissed by the greater scientific community and the anthropological community. But you have to understand that the idea that there's never been a matriarchy is not a bad thing. It's not. I do not believe men can raise children. I'm sorry, they can't. And I have seen the primate studies. I have corresponded on the primate studies. If you remove the mother from the parental investment in the primate, the child will die. End of story. If you remove the father from the parental investment, the child will not die. The child will live a perfect existence. The child will be nourished by the mother. One of the reasons why this is because I have mentioned again that the mother is a biochemical analog to her baby. She is an extension of the baby's substance in almost every way possibly conceivable. One of these ways, I have not mentioned yet, but it's important, is the breast milk. The breast milk is literally a perfect cocktail of nutrients and fibers that if were absent from the meal of the child, the father would have to go somehow into nature and find that cocktail. Somehow gather the materials for that cocktail to feed the infant. The type of resources that requires, the expenditure of energy that requires, rather than just going to the mother and getting breast milk, which is a perfect biochemical and nutrient cocktail for the infant. You take away the mother from the parental investment, the infant dies. The father is not equipped to find all those materials, to find all those resources. And that's how much of the substance the baby is to the mother. They're co-eternal beings in a very real sense. And it's, again, why I despise, absolutely, SEL and Polyphyletic dogma, because it suggests that it's no longer the mother's job to raise the child. It's now the state's job. Well, let's see what children turn into if that's the case. And this is reflecting biological data. There is no way you can counteract these facts. And so matriarchy. The reason why the reason why society is fundamentally patriarchal every single time you analyze a society or a culture, every single time, is not because of some neo-Marxist ploy, or it's not because androcentric men wanted to oppress women. Sure, there's been a lot of oppression. Yeah, absolutely. But that has nothing to do with the fact that patriarchy is inevitable. It is inevitable if I give you the low-resolution analysis, because men are more aggressive than women every single time. And that goes into the transgender literature, which suggests, obviously, that you can be born into the wrong body, but the neurochemistry doesn't fundamentally change. And but you do suffer. You suffer existentially because you are trapped. You are trapped, and you're experiencing an existence that is dichotomous to the brain process. And the disease that's called is sexual dysmorphia. And sometimes you can call it identity dysmorphia. Those are real transsexual people, okay? And it's important to distinguish between real transsexual people who are screaming for our help and those who are ideologically laden and ideologically possessed, okay? And the Marcusian left wants to suggest, again, that patriarchy and the transgender is a product that was created by men who wanted to oppress women and hold their sex as the archetype for humanity. There isn't any society that suggests men are the archetype of humanity. There isn't any society like that. But that's what they believe, and it's a grand conspiracy theory. Now, I've mentioned some of the biophysics of gender persona, and that it all leads to biophysics. It all leads to post- and prenatal endocrinology that manifests the behavior. So if you have a female brain, right, if you have a female brain, that's considered a biological reality. What manifests from that is a female personality, okay? Now, you may not have always a female brain. Well, I mean, if you're born with a female brain, you have a female brain for your whole life forever. If you're born with a male brain, you will have a male brain for your entire life forever. But there are instances where there is a blend, okay? And that blend is a biological reality. It may, the behavioral manifestations from that blend is what you may call the gender spectrum. And the gender spectrum, you are either female or male, right? And then you can have all you want in between male and female. There isn't anything else. I'm sorry, there isn't. So the gender spectrum is, you could call it womanhood and manlyhood, right? And each is on the other side of the spectrum. You can have whatever you want as long as it's within the confines of that spectrum, right? And so that's where the gender spectrum comes in, right? But the fundamentally false, wrong, and patently lying idea is to suggest that the gender spectrum is controllable, that you can choose what gender you have. And the answer to that is no. You cannot choose whether or not you're homosexual. You cannot choose whether you're heterosexual. You cannot choose whether you're trans or whether you're not trans. You just can't do that. I'm sorry. If you are trans, it was because you were born trans. And yes, there are medications. Gender dysmorphia is an actual illness, and what society calls that is transgenderism. And it's not a bad thing that it's a disease or that it's an illness. You can treat it, right? You can do things like therapy and hormonal treatments and things like that. But the people you should be protecting are authentically trans people. And most people in society today, especially in the post-Marcusian radical left ethos, are not transgendered people. And that's why when they want to get a transition, they realize that they have fundamentally made an existential error. And guess what? There's no going back from that. So the word we're defining is gender. And gender is very, very simple. It's the behavioral manifestations of a fixed biological reality. That biological reality is on a spectrum, of either male or female. You're either male or you're either female. There isn't anything else you could possibly be, and you can be within maybe that spectrum. There's a spectrum, right? There are people who are born post and prenatal endocrinologically male or female, and sometimes people have a blend of that. They call it androgyny, and but you don't get to choose that. Gender is not some type of substance in the ether. It isn't. Gender is the result of a fixed biological reality. That is very important to understand what gender is. Now, the question, what is a woman? And this is where I will conclude. I'm sorry, what?
Come on. I can't get up because I'm on that thing.
So, in some ways, I would conclude here in this instance, we can ask the question, what is a woman? And Matt Walsh did a documentary which was not entirely accurate, but was ingenious in its own right.
I'm sorry, I can't hear you. I think someone needs to mute.
Okay, 1 second, I'll mute him. Hold on here. So there was a political commentator named Matt Walsh, and he did a documentary, which it's funny because the documentary received very high reviews on almost all sides of the political spectrum, except, of course, for the radical Marcusean left. So even leftists radically praised this movie. And it has a solid 8.1 rating on IMDb, which is used as a weighted scoring system. And if you're getting a score on IMDb, something above 8, you have pleased the masses. There isn't any question about that. And the first thing I would say about that documentary is it's not entirely accurate. The science behind it is not accurate entirely, and that's just fine because the documentary in itself is an ingenious, wonderful documentary. It really is. But the documentary is called "What is a Woman?" and despite the scientific problems with the documentary, which is just fine. I mean, Matt Walsh is not anything approaching a scientist. That's just fine. The point of the documentary was to show that the radical Marcusean left doesn't know how to define a woman. And you can define a woman. A woman, for example, is the behavioral manifestations of a fixed biological reality, just on the side of female. So if you're a female, you have a biological reality of being a female, right? That has things to do with morphology. It has things to do, with the neurochemistry and all that stuff. All that stuff adds up, right? The behavioral manifestations of female, which is a biological reality, is what a woman is. Okay? And now it's funny because in the documentary he talks about, he goes to professors with PhDs in gender studies, whatever that means, in queer dance theory, whatever that is. I like to make up things like, I have a PhD in critical midget studies, and I'm going to do something with my life with that. And, okay, sure, that's going to happen. But he goes to college campuses with professors who have PhDs in non-academic subjects, such as gender studies or women's studies, and he asks the question, which is the title of the documentary, what is a woman? And the answer, every single time, is it's a woman. A woman is a woman. It's circular, circular, circular. And he asks, define a woman without using the word woman. And nobody can do it. No, it's just absolutely hilarious. And it just shows you how postmodern the gender ideology is. One of the fundamental things about the documentary is that's what it shows. It shows that gender ideology is nothing but postmodernism. And there is, according to the literature, woman can be defined. It's the biological, it is the behavioral manifestations of a biological reality. The biological reality would be the fact that you're female. The female is the biological reality. And the Marcusean left believes that the word male and the word woman and man are social fictions, and are not tethered to biological realities like female and male. And it's like one of the things the documentary shows is that, and it's ridiculous. It is absolutely stupid that you would go to a professor with a PhD and they don't know how to define a woman. It's absolutely hilarious because it's like you're an adult, and yeah, you can go to the dictionary, and I think in the dictionary it'll tell you that a woman is a biological female, right? Which is half correct. It's definitely more correct than a woman, which is the only answer that you'll ever get in that documentary. It's half correct. The other half would be it's actually the behavioral manifestations of woman, of female. And so in terms of the postmodern philosophy, the fairy godmothers of the ideology, of the gender ideology, are Gail Rubin and Judith Butler, both self-admitted postmodernists, both self-admitted Marxists, and they are the most influential writers in the world right now on gender studies, women's studies, queer theory, and the bulk of literature of all those disciplines are pumped out by these two people in terms of citation count. So also Gail Rubin's a pedophile, and she says she's a pedophile explicitly, not entirely those words, but in the first chapter of her infamous article, which has received such high praise in the Marcusean left. It is one of the most cited articles ever in the Marcusean literature, and it's called Thinking Sex. And the first chapter talks about how pedophiles are sexualized minorities that need to be liberated. And that's the verbatim quote, actually. She explicitly says, pedophiles are sexual minorities that need to be liberated. And she is all for creeps. And she's all for perverts. Because creeps and perverts are sexualized minorities that need to be liberated. And so she takes this radical, Derridian linguistic framework and instantiates it onto gender. And she suggests that pedophile is something that the status quo has created to oppress pedophiles. So she's all for reducing the age of consent to essentially 0, and she's all for the code term that she uses so people don't call her pedophile is called cross-generational relationships. If you have half a brain, you'll know that means pedophilia. But throughout the entire infamous text, she talks about the need for cross-generational relationships, and that's just pedophilia. I'm sorry, that's just pedophilia. Judith Butler, on the other hand, also pedophile, she's far more sophisticated than Gail Rubin. She's written a lot more than Gail Rubin. She is far more cited than Gail Rubin. She invented the concept of gender performativity, and that gender, you can transcend gender, and you can transcend sexual biological categories, and but more importantly, that these categories were put into place to oppress people. So gender roles, for example, were put in place to oppress people. This is fundamentally the work of Judith Butler, that categorical norms were put into place to oppress people. But there is a means of transcending these categorical norms. This is the philosophy of Judith Butler. Everything that she writes is absolutely terrible. There isn't anything that she has ever written that is true. And but she's very good at using language. She is absolutely brilliant at using language. She's fundamentally a language expert. But the reason why she won the Worst Writing Award is because her awesome techniques at using language just makes it so hyper cryptic that nobody can understand it. And it's just adorable because it's like, okay, you're going to write trash that nobody can understand because you're good at using language. Okay, you'll get the award for worst writing in terms of literature. And but the point is, at this instance, is that the gender ideology perpetuated by Gail Rubin and Judith Butler, among many others, but these guys are the most cited, is patently postmodernist. It's postmodernist. And it's postmodernist because the purpose of gender ideology is to subvert objective reality. Because it's objective reality that they're facing. It is the data that they're facing. The idea, there's no data suggesting that women and men are different, fundamentally, in many fundamental ways. The idea that that is true wouldn't be the case if there wasn't postmodernism makes that itself a fact. The fact that there needs to be postmodernism at all in terms of gender anything or sex anything means that what you're doing is you're trying to subvert objective reality because it's objective reality that you're facing. It's objective reality that you're fighting. It's the data that you're fighting. The fact that there's postmodernism at all means that there's data, means that there's an objective reality wherein women and men fundamentally differ. And so before I end here, I will briefly talk about, I gave a very low resolution analysis of the biophysics of the gender personae, and the first was things such as parental investment and the social space where to raise a child, and that, of course, there isn't anywhere else to raise a child other than in a home. The other thing in terms of the biophysics of gender I discussed were things such as the baby, the infant, being literally a biochemical analog to the mother. They are co-eternal with each other. They are part of the same substance. This is fundamentally a reality. This is a reality because you can see it with your own eyes. This is a reality because you can hear it with your own ears. But you don't have to even do that. You can just go to the data and the literature. These are very important. And along a very long evolutionary trajectory, you'll see why there are differences between men and women and why there are behavioral differences between the men and women. It all goes back to sexual selection, you can call it that, or in other words, in many other cases, what women have to do and what men have to do. Right? Men have to traverse space, right? Women do not need to traverse space. They need to establish a space. Men traverse space, and that's why they have a higher cognitive capacity for things such as temporal spatial awareness. That's why they have what they call a more sensitive, dense superior colliculus, which is a part of the brain that has a lot to do with measuring things in space in terms of maybe you need to jump on a particular dot in space. Maybe you need to jump onto a particular platform. All that is organized, all that is placed in the functioning of a brain part called the superior colliculus. And you can go to brain parts, you can go to brain areas, and you'll see that they are different. Men and women have different brains because you can see them. You can feel them. They have different weights as well. They have different neuronal densities. They have different modalities of connectivity. And this is not trivial. This explains a lot of things in today's society. And so that was a very low resolution of the biophysics of the gender personae. And if you understand, for and foremost, that gender is the behavioral manifestations of a fixed biological reality, that fixed biological reality may be the fact that you're either a female or a male. If you're a male, your gender is going to be, for the most part, masculine. Masculinity is the behavioral manifestations of that fixed biological reality. Now, within those two things, female and male, there is a spectrum. Yes, we can talk about the spectrum. Within the spectrum, you may be more masculine and less feminine, but you may be a woman. But there's nothing outside of those confines. There's nothing outside that gender spectrum. The gender spectrum at the far end is male, and at the other end is female. There is a spectrum between those loci, and that's just fine. Okay, so that was a little bit of the biophysics. There was a very low resolution of the biophysics. I didn't really get into the literature. I kind of wanted to talk about Eleanor Maccabee and perhaps Costin McCry and Tubian Cosmides and perhaps David C. Geary. Perhaps these are the biggest giants, and all these people point in the same direction. It's because they are evidence-based and they're data-driven. And nobody argues with these people. These people are the titans in the field of post and neuroendocrinology, post and prenatal neuroendocrinology. They're titans in the field of biochemistry. They're titans in the field of psychology. And, you know, all these different fields, all these different subjects, they're all pointing in the same direction, okay? Now, in terms of the psychology, there is a thing called the Big Five Personality Traits Model. And it's an excellent model for determining, again, the behavioral manifestations of the female and the male. And the Big Five Personality Traits Model is the most fundamental inventory ever written. So Big Five is very important because the Big Five explains why there are disparities among men and women, why there are fundamental disparities between men and women, and they're not social fictions. The disparities are real, and the causes of the disparities are not social fictions. They are real. Now, the Big Five consists of neuroticism, openness, conscientiousness, agreeableness, and extroversion. Now, in terms of things like why do women get paid less, right? There used to be, obviously, very discriminatory laws in the past. Those don't exist anymore at all. There isn't a single openly calculating, discriminating law in American jurisprudence, in federal American jurisprudence at all. Zero. So we'll throw that out of the picture. Well, it has a lot to do with the Big Five, the big personality traits. And what the Big Five has determined every single time, in very simplistic terms, is, and this, again, we've kind of talked about the biophysics, we're talking about the psychology, what the Big Five has determined, in very simplistic terms, is that women, on the aggregate, have a far more attention towards relations and a far higher affinity for relations, and men in the aggregate have a far, far higher affinity for things. So I'm going to say obviously the hyper-sexist thing and the hyper-misogynist thing, and I'm going to say that, well, women don't want to be engineers. And I'm sorry, that is a fundamental objective reality. They don't want to be engineers because engineers deal with the coldness of the earth. The engineers deal with the coldness of materials. The engineers deal with the coldness of inanimate objects. Women don't want to be engineers, and the Big Five Personality Traits Model shows you why they don't want to be engineers. It's because women have a higher fixation and a higher affinity towards relations. Now, men don't want to be nurses. Men don't want to be social workers, right? And now, if you'll read, the reason why there's a gender pay gap, and this is a big reason, is because things that an intention towards things, such as the coldness of the earth, such as the objects of the earth, such as inanimate objects, cost more money, right? To produce an engineer versus to produce a social worker costs a lot more money, right? Because you have to go through the material process of becoming an engineer. There's no material process into becoming a social worker. Now, engineers get paid more. If your job is revolving around things that involve objects, you're going to get paid more. If your job is revolving around things like relations, you will get paid less. So the question fundamentally is, should we induce quotas, or should we produce a system, a liberal system, in which women are able to choose to do otherwise? Right? If women are made to choose to do otherwise, if they're given the opportunity to choose to do otherwise, well, women don't want to be engineers, okay? They're going to get paid less because they don't want to be engineers. Well, if we induce quotas instead, if we induce a radical distribution scheme, a radical parity distribution scheme, you can call it equity, what happens is we will make a quota in which we will hire more women to be engineers, and we'll hire less men to be engineers. Of course, the reason why you're hiring less men will be based on the fact they're men, okay? And that's discrimination. You're judging based on an immutable characteristic of being a man that you can't be an engineer because we don't have enough women, right? Or would you rather produce a society, a liberal society, in which women and men are able to choose otherwise? Now, this is called egalitarianism, and there is a 20-year-plus study, a study that has been conducted for 20 years. And what the study shows, and this is studies conducted by a person, one of the people, Catherine Hakim, you can look her up. She's one of the world's foremost leading experts on occupational analysis. And what they have found, that if you go to places like Scandinavia, and this is where they actually did the studies, and it's a 20-year-plus study, okay? So the data that they're producing, it's also worthy to note that the experts who did this study, the results were completely contradictory to what their claims were to be first. And the results suggested that the more egalitarian a society is, the greater the differences between men and women become. So, in other words, if you give women the opportunity to choose what they wish to do, rather than inducing quotas, inducing reparations, inducing radical parity distribution schemes, inducing equity, if you rather produce a liberal society and say, well, we're going to give you the opportunity to do whatever the heck you want to do. Sure, you may be biologically primed to be a mother, but the point in a liberal society is you can do and be someone else. You can do and be otherwise, right? Well, the people who have taken this to the extremes, and this is called egalitarianism, is Scandinavia. And Scandinavia, you'll see, the differences between men and women are the greatest than anywhere else in the world. In other words, if you have a society that is egalitarian, the differences between men and women grow. If you leave them be and let them make their own decisions, the differences between them grow, okay? So the 5 personality traits model, which suggests that women are more, have a higher affinity, a biological affinity towards relations, and men, and again, this is in very, very simplistic terms, and men have a higher affinity towards things, that is the manifestation of a fixed biological reality. This explains, according to the data, at least 20% of the gender pay gap. And 20% doesn't sound a lot, but it is a lot. It is a lot. And there are actually other reasons for the gender pay gap that fill in. Very little of the gender pay gap nowadays, because we live in, for the most part, a liberal society in which women can choose to do otherwise, in which men can choose to do otherwise. Very little of the gender pay gap has to do with discrimination and social fictions. But in Scandinavia, you'll see that the data is crystal clear. And Catherine Hakim and her team, along with other areas of expertise and other experts in various fields, her team has concluded that the more egalitarian a society is, the more you leave people off to be who they want to be, the greater the differences between men and women become. And so that is very important, because that statement, that data is so unbelievably hypertoxic to the gender ideology. It is so hypertoxic that it actually paralyzes them, and it paralyzes any type of their radical Marcusean efforts, because you can't argue with the data. You can't argue with the data. And the data, so when I say 20 years, what I mean by 20 years is the data is being replicated and replicated and replicated. And the conclusions keep on becoming the same and the same and the same. 20 years of replicating data, okay? There's no way you can fake that. And the experts, too, are from all the way around the world, different places of the world. They're not even associated with each other. Most of them don't even know their names. They just produce an article. They throw it through the peer review process, which is a panel of experts that look at the article, and then that panel of experts sends it to another panel of experts to look at the article, and that process continues and recycles. And what you end up at that is called a published paper. And what Catherine Hakim did and her team was produce a meta-analysis, which is a statistical approximation of all those papers, right? So none of them have anything to do with each other. They all have different political backgrounds. They have different political saturations. A meta-analysis is an attempt to gather up hundreds of papers and produce a statistical output. And so Catherine Hakim did this, and she found that what all these papers are saying, the meta-analysis concluded that the more egalitarian a society is, the greater the differences between men and women become. Okay? And you can't fake this data because nobody knows who these people are. In terms of so if I'm publishing a paper, I don't know who the other person in the other side of the world who is publishing a similar paper. I don't know who he is. I don't know what his political background is, right? So the meta-analysis is a statistical approximation of all these papers and with a valued output. The valued output is either a positive or negative in terms of an established premise. The premise is our society is more egalitarian, and so meta-analyses aren't just papers. And what a meta-analysis looks like, if you look at one, it'll look like a paper, but it's not. It's actually a grand assortment of papers. And what the meta-analysis does is it uses statistical models and methods to find a correlational output of the papers that are being analyzed. And so Catherine Hakim is at the forefront of all that. And it's been 20 years, and the data hasn't changed. Okay. Now this is not the biophysics or anything. This is the psychology of things, which in a lot of ways correlate. But it is not data you can argue with. It's not data that you can claim to be a grand conspiracy theory and that there's an ideological backing behind it. It's like, it's not. It was a meta-analysis, which means that the papers that are involved have no conflict of interests. The papers that are involved are essentially random samples. And so I just thought that was very important to mention. So I guess this would have me conclude on, we talked about the infant being a biochemical analog to the mother, and that the infant is, in a very real sense, an extension of the mother's substance and vice versa. So that's the biophysical side of things. And then we mentioned things like matriarchy and 2 neuropeptides that are fundamental in manifesting behavioral situations, and that was oxytocin and testosterone. And as I've mentioned, though this is a very low-resolution analysis of things, this is a hyper-accurate, low-resolution analysis of things. Of course, there are more hormones that go into the equation here, but this is a hyper-accurate, though very low-resolution analysis of things that is real and effective. And so we talked about those 2 dichotomous neuropeptides, and then we talked about the psychology of it all. And what the psychology is a manifestation of a biological reality. It is the manifestation of, you could call a brain state. And a brain state is the metamorphosis of all antecedent brain states. So the psychology of it is very interconnected with the biophysics of it. They are cross-disciplinary. Okay, so it's all the same exact science. It's just you could say that it's a different domain of analysis, but it's all saying the same stuff. That women and men are different, and it doesn't matter if there is a postmodernist ethos suggesting otherwise, one that is led by Gail Rubin and Judith Butler, okay, and that the gender ideology, I think, which is most important to understand lastly, is that the gender ideology is responding to objective reality. And that's very important, because if you're at a university campus and you are in an environment that is ideologically possessed, they're going to suggest to you that there is data that suggests that, gender differences are actually social fictions. And rather, there is a hegemonic system that has normalized the status quo into the lives of people, and that induces a false consciousness. So you believe that you're free and things like this. Well, you ask them to cite the data. You ask them, what data is this? What data is this, right? And the data that they'll cite is postmodern jargon, okay? Very little data is going to reach scientific consensus and scientific peer review that isn't postmodernist, that isn't social constructivist, okay? So it all leads back to postmodernism as the first side of the woke persona. I didn't get into the politics of it all, which you can suggest is the neo-Marxist side of things. So that's the neo-Marxist postmodernist imbuement. So that is in terms of gender ideology. Gender ideology, you must understand, is a postmodern project. And you don't have to do any thinking. You can just go to the fairy godmothers of gender ideology, Gail Rubin and Judith Butler. And you can maybe go on Wikipedia and look up who Gail Rubin and Judith Butler is. And in Wikipedia, you'll see that the first thing about Gail Rubin and Judith Butler is that postmodernists, and that they're heavily reliant on Foucault and Derrida and Jacques Lacan, who was a fraudulent psychiatrist but influential in the Marcusian left, and that they're also fixated with Marx and people like Jerry Lukács and Antonio Gramsci. And you know, it's all the same stuff. It's postmodern neo-Marxism. You'll never, ever see any of these people cite a real scientist, ever. Not once, ever. And I've done the research myself. I've read these people's texts. I've not seen them, ever, cite a real scientist, a scientist who isn't ideologically possessed and sickened. So it's very simple from here on out. It's very simple. The gender ideology is fundamentally a postmodern project. Okay, and it's postmodern for a very good reason, and the answer to that question, why is it all postmodernist, is a savoring and satisfying answer. It's, again, because what they're doing is responding to an objective reality. And it's the objective reality that they have, that they are fighting, right? It's the data that they are fighting. It's the de facto status quo that they're fighting, okay? It's the fact that they're fighting it that is the answer. And that's really all that needs to be said about that. So this concludes this lecture on the gender personae, the biophysics of gender persona, and the postmodern behind everything against the data. So if there are any questions, this would be the time and place to ask.
No questions?
Nothing? No.
I have. Is somebody talking? Because I'm waiting. Other people to go first?
My questions usually refer to the school system, so
Sure.
all of this has infiltrated our public school systems, and
absolutely.
It's not seen as one person anymore that has this dysphoria, which I understand is a real thing, but it's now like a culture thing. And not only, you know, are the kids just joining up, doing it together because it's something new to do, because I understand being middle school age and how that is, but the counselors, the school counselors, are pushing them to, you know, how do we fight against that other than in the home? I guess we can just go back through what you just said and try to talk to people about what has happened and the data. I mean, I don't understand. To me, it's just common sense, the difference between a man and a woman, but it has really gotten confusing for a lot of people. And what what hurts me the most is seeing confused young children when they shouldn't be confused about these things.
Absolutely. So I guess I could answer that question, which is partial. The first thing is that when you are born into a world where objective reality doesn't take precedence, which is the postmodernist world, which is the post-Marcusian world, you become part of that water that flows through everything. And so it's very hard to get out of that because you have been born into it. And so why people are confused has a lot to do with being born into the system. And the system is fundamentally anti-realist. And the way to fight back is the data. The way to fight, because there's not even organic ways to deny the data. There's not even conceptual ways to deny the data. Data is data, and the only way to deny the data is more data, you could say. And the data would have to be empirical. The data would have to be evidence-based. The data could not be something like a positional standpoint epistemology, which is the other side of epistemology. It's the idea, again, that there is no objective reality, and that my lived experience, my voice of my neo-Marxist marginalized status has higher truth value than things like evidence in the court of law, i.e. the O.J. Simpson case, that it has a higher truth value than things like logic. And this is what positional standpoint epistemology is. It's the tool used to subvert objective reality, and it started with the feminists. Sandra Harding is the person who coined the term. And but the way to fight back is to master the linguistic territory first and foremost, because you can't navigate into any of this stuff if you're not able to navigate the words, which are simultaneous with thought. And then the second thing is to know the literature, and we haven't done that yet. The course on that is called Knowing Your Enemies, and that is the next series. And we'll be discussing literature and what it means and what it is and who the people are. We have not discussed who these people are. And when I say things like Gail Rubin and Judith Butler, I'm talking about the people in terms of gender ideology. There isn't anybody else that the Marcusian left goes to other than these people in the aggregate, in the bulk, in general. They have the highest citation count. And so because they have the highest citation count, it's what's taught in the colleges. And the way to fight back is to understand this, and that there is a way to master this literature. So, and that hasn't happened yet, obviously, but that is to come.